In this upcoming lesson, we're going to be covering how to create elements dynamically and then also how to make them interactive. And they all are going to be working independently. So when you click them, they're going to become active. They're going to make 100 moves. We've got separate counters on each one of them, so they can all run at the same time. And we're using the request animation frame. So setting up the different properties and adding it to the element on the page. We only have one element on the page, and that's this one with a class of output. So we're making some updates, and this is all done with JavaScript. We're selecting the bounding client rectangle in order to get the boundaries of the element. And then we're adding an event listener, which is the DOM content loaded. So whenever the DOM content is loaded and ready to go, that's where we're going to generate the elements inside of the main parent, which is the output. We can control all of the parameters here within one game object, so we can dynamically change the number of elements that we're creating, and that will update the number of elements that are appearing on the page. And so if we change that to 4, that will limit it to 4. The counter is how many moves they're going to make. The moves, there's the elements that are on the page, so every time we're adding an element, we're adding it into the else array, and then there's the speed that we're moving it. And this is going to be where we're creating the elements, and that's going to be dynamically created from a function called maker. So we're setting all of the properties of the element and then returning the element object back to where it was requested. And here's where we're adding it into the game else array. And then as we loop through the request animation frame that's running a function called updater, we iterate through all the game elements that we've got on the screen. We check to see if they have a value of move or they've been clicked, and then we do through the action where we're making that movement and applying the various conditions as the elements moving on the screen. So covering all of this in this upcoming lesson. So go ahead and create index HTML file or HTML file, link it to a JS file. In this case, I'm calling it app2.js. And I've got one element on the page. It's got a class of output. So we're going to be selecting that within the JavaScript code. So selecting the element and using the document query selector to select the element with a class of output. And once we've made that selection, this is where we can add additional elements into the page to create our application. So as we are going to be adding multiple elements, let's create a variable, and we'll just call it game. And we can have an object actually, and within this object we'll set a variable called num. So this is going to be the number of elements that we want to create once the page loads, and we're going to be setting up on the document object add event listener, and the event that we're going to be listening for is DOM content loaded. So once this event fires off, we're going to launch a function called init, and then within the init, this is where we're going to create the page elements. So set that function up, init, and then within here, for now, we're going to output into the console log that we're ready to move on to the next step of the application build. So once you launch that, I've got that in the browser on the right-hand side. So we do see that ready. So that means that the code is running properly, and we're okay to move on to the next part where we want to create some elements and add them into output and then have them move and then be able to click them and set different ones to be moving. And we're just going to be moving back and forth. So selecting those elements and creating the elements, let's create a function that will generate some page elements for us. And I'll just call it maker. Just right now, I'll leave it as a placeholder. So what we want to do in init is we want to create a loop. So we're set the value of x to be 0, and we're going to loop through while x is less than the value of game num. So that's that value that we set here within the game object. So that way we can add multiple elements as needed. We'll increment x by 1, and this is where we're going to be creating the elements. So we can do it this way where we're creating a div using the document create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div. Within the div, let's set some text content, and set the text content as a value of x plus 1. So that will give multiple elements that are going to increment. And then lastly, we want to take that and append that div to the output element. So what that did is that essentially created the 3 elements for the page. Then we'll apply some styling to those elements. So there's our 3 elements that we're potentially going to be moving on the page. And in order to clean up the code a little bit, usually the way that I like to do it is if I'm creating multiple elements, I create a function that's going to manage that. So that will make the code a little bit more readable. And the purpose of this is just going to be to make multiple elements. So we've still got our loop there, and we want to create divs. So we'll set it up as element and have the function maker. And within maker, I want to send over the string type. So this is going to be the type of the element. So just put it into the arguments of the maker. So L, we'll call it LT. So LT. And then the text that we want, so I'll just call that HTML. And this is going to be received as HTML. So we'll just replace the HTML with the value of x plus 1. And then within the function, type out HTML. And then also let's add in the parent element that we want to send to. So that's going to be the output. So use output there. And here we can reference it as parent. So that's going to be the parent element. And then what we want to do is we want to return back the newly constructed element and send that back into L. And actually, I just call it parent element. So we want to return that back. So let's do a return. And if we actually do append child, that will have a response back. So sending that element back. And now within the console log, let's write out those elements in the console. So that just shows you that we're actually accessing all of those elements. Let's apply some properties to those elements. So we can set up a class, or we can just apply the properties here within the init, or we can apply the properties within the maker area. So what we want to do is we want to set those up as movable elements on the page. So let's add in those properties where we've got the properties of style and setting the position so that we can move them on the page. And I'll set the position to absolute. So that will allow us to use the left and right properties. Also for the elements, we can set a left property. And so this is a value that we can use. Since this is going to be x plus 1 is going to be numeric. So we can set the value of the HTML, or maybe we want to send a separate value for position. So let's add in the value of x, and then that can serve as a way to set up the position. So setting the position, we'll get the position times 100, and then concatenate the px so that we've got the string position, div style, and let's do the top and do the same value here for the position from the top. And I'll keep them separate, so in case you do want to adjust the top and the left positions. Let's also add to the elements. We'll set up a width for it, and let's set that at 100 pics. So this needs a string value, so just set that up as 100 pics. And then also we're going to do the same for the height so that we get this box type feel. And one last one, we'll set the border style for it, and the border can be a 1-pic solid black border for now. So let's see what that looks like. So that sets all of those page elements. I'm going to shrink the screen size. So now I have it at 150. So let's bring it back down to 100. It can also set some properties to make the text look a little bit better. So doing a font align, text align, and center the text. So that will center the text, and we want to horizontally center it. We can set the line height. So setting the line height property will allow you to set and vertically as well as horizontally align it with the text align. So that aligns the numbers of those elements a little bit better. And I'm going to actually just adjust it to be slightly smaller there. So that way they look more independent there. And of course you can apply whatever properties you feel necessary. So we want to actually make these that they're moving automatically and have them clickable to stop the action. So set a default value of count. And so right now that will just have a default value of 0. And we're going to, every time we launch the counter, we'll have a counter value that's going to count down and constantly make some action and movement for the elements. And we'll also can contain the request animation frame within here as well. So I'm going to just set it as a blank object. And once we launch the action, we can set the game move object to the window request animation frame. So that will give us a way to do some animations. And I'll write to a function, call to a function called updater. So next let's create that function, updater. And we want to have the ability to loop to that function. So within the updater, we're going to constantly request that animation frame. So it will continuously make those movements. So now we can track any type of actions on those elements. And I wanted to add the event listeners to those elements. So selecting the element and do an add event listener. So we're dynamically adding the click event to the element. We'll just run a function called moveMe and create that function. So within the counter, let's update this to a value of 100. So this will be how much it's going to be moving, how many redraws on the frames that we're going to run the movement for. And we'll also within the element, so because the element is an object, we'll set a value of move to be 0. So within the updater, or within the moveMe, whenever the element gets clicked, first we'll log out so that we can select the element that we're referencing and go into the console, clear the console. So that's going to be referencing the element that was clicked by using this. So that means that we can take this object, which is going to be referring to the event target, and we can provide some action to that. So set this element and update the move value to be equal to whatever the game counter is. So this way we can dynamically set those values to all of the elements. And within the updater, I want to add in all of the elements so that we're creating within an array as well. So create an array here called Ls. And then as we create a new element, we're going to take the game Ls and add to that array that new element that we just created. And then as we go through updater, we can loop through the game Ls array using for each. And that will pick up each one of the elements as we iterate through the array. And here we can check to see if game move is larger than 0. So within we'll have a condition that's going to check to see if element move value is greater than 0. And if it is, then we'll take the current element style and we'll set the background color and we'll equal that to red for now. So now when I click these, they're going to be red because we're updating the value of the element and the counter of the element. So we can also add to the element text content whatever the value of element move is. So that way we can see those values. So we see that the value of element move is all 100 across all of them. So because we've detected them that we want to move them, so let's add in the movement action. So take the element move, subtract from it, and eventually this won't be true. So then we can also have an else, and we can set it back to white. So we see that they're all having these countdowns, and when they complete the countdowns, then it's going back to the default color. So that means that we can move the page elements. So within a variable, we want to get whatever the left position is. So for the element, instead of adding the element move value, let's get the offset left value of the element, because we're going to need that in order to calculate the position and then also update it. And see, the move is still active in the background. So right now when we're clicking it, we're updating the text content with whatever the offset left is. So we can use that as a position and make some updates to that position. And also going to set another property within here to direction. And we'll just set that as 1. So that means that whenever we hit the boundaries of the output element, then we can bounce them off the boundaries. So let's add in a height and a width for the output element, or we'll just add in a width for it. So let's set the style. And right now we'll set the border so we can see the boundaries of the main parent element. So the main parent element, we don't have any height, and it's just got the default width of the entire element object. So let's set some properties to it and set the default height to be 500 pix and set that as a string value. And then also let's set the style width to be 500 pix as well. So that way we've got some boundaries that we want to work out of. And I'm actually going to update, instead of absolute, let's set this to relative. So that will make them relative within their parent. So that's the main boundaries, and we want to be able to click them and have them move from side to side. And we've set up a direction that we can use in order to accommodate the direction. And the direction is going to switch whenever it hits the boundary. So we'll set that up afterwards as a condition. So let's get the movement in first. So we're getting the offset left position. And let's set that up as a variable, position x, and that's going to get this value. And we can use that value to adjust the value by the speed. And just using the position x value, as this is going to be changing. So let's add in one more parameter within the game and set that as speed. So this is the speed that we want to move it at. So right now let's just set it to 1. And take the position x and add to position x the game speed and multiply it by the element direction. So this will, once we change this to -1, it will move it the other way. And that's why we've got the direction in there. So right now it will update the position. So taking the element and style left value, set that to position x and adding in the pix in order to properly position that property. So what's happening now is that they are moving, and we want to keep them moving within the parameters. So they've moved all the way over there because they're taking the value and the speed and the counter value. So that's incrementing those values accordingly. So we want to also subtract from the move. So let's see what that value is. So element move. And so basically what it's doing is it's moving the 100 spots over. So we want to have some conditions that in case we're off to the end of the limits of the border, we want to switch directions. So let's add that condition in and check to see if position X value is greater than. For this, we're going to need the boundaries of the output object. So let's create a global object. We'll call it bound output. And this will use an object using get bounding client rectangle. And we can output that value into the console. So it's just called bound output. And I do need to comment that out. So it's throwing an error. So now we see we've got an object here, and we've got the right position of that element. So we can use that value from the right position from the bound output. And now that's an object. So using that right value and checking to see if the value of position X is greater than the 510. And if it is, then we take the element direction and multiply it by -1. And let's also output into the console. And I'll just write in too far and do some quick debugging here. So it is detecting that it's too far, but what it's doing is it's not changing the direction. So one of the problems here is that offset left is taking the value from the entire screen, whereas we're looking to have it within the parent because we've got an output value from the parent. So what we want to do is we want to actually set a position of X. So instead of a direction, let's set up an X position. We can take that element and set its default position from the offset left. And then now we're going to be using this position and updating it. So instead of selecting it within the updater function, we've got an object value that's going to be tracked. So we can console log out that element X position. And here we can see if the element X position is greater than the bound output right value. And if it is, instead of multiplying that by 1, we're going to multiply the element X position. And we also want to add in, and this is going to be the move value. So instead of taking it from the current game speed, we're going to have them all have a separate game speed. And that means that we can take this game speed value and multiply it by -1. So that will actually move it within the other position, the other direction. And instead of moving the X position, we're going to update this value, the X position, with whatever we've got for the element move, and also update that value there. So just a few adjustments. And now when we save it, now we're only incrementing by 1. And when it does hit the end there, it will change direction. So you also notice that it's slightly still off the boundaries. Because once again, we're using the bound output right in order to accommodate that. Let's update the speed so it's a little bit quicker, and we can do it within 1 click. So we also want to have a second condition and add in the or if element X position is less than 0, then we want it to change the direction back. So we need to adjust the right position value, where we need to subtract the width of the element. So select the element offset width, and we'll subtract that. So that will get us where the boundaries are and allow us to change direction whenever we're hitting the boundaries. And now this is going to be the same thing for each one of those. As we're hitting the boundaries, it'll change the direction. So this has been an example of how you can dynamically create some elements, also add events to those elements, and then have some properties within those elements where we're applying some movement And that's all done using the request animation frame. And then now, because we've got it all controlled within the main game object, we can add in additional items as well and have them all interact and be interactive independently. And also, as we're generating them and creating them, let's update them and only add in by 10. So that will fit them all into the output area. So try out the code, create your own version in order to get more familiar with the properties and methods covered within this lesson.